This is lesson 14.4, the era of global contact. Explain how the era of global contact was shaped by new forms of exploitation, commercial exchange, and forced migration. That means slavery, people. And once again, contextualizing the Renaissance and the Discovery. Explain the context in which the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery developed. We need to do that, and we've seen this already also for about the third or fourth time. Europeans explored and settled overseas territories, encountering and interacting with indigenous populations. And we've also seen this. European nations were driven by commercial and religious motives to explore overseas territories and establish colonies. And we've seen this. Rivals on the world stage. Explain how and why trading networks and colonial expansion affected relations between and among European states. But we haven't seen this. The Spanish established colonies across the Americas, Caribbean, and Pacific, which made Spain a dominant state in Europe in the 16th century. Maybe we have seen this. Then the Atlantic nations of France, England, and the Netherlands followed by establishing their own colonies and trading networks to compete with Portuguese and Spanish dominance in the 17th century. So you got your 16th century, you got your 17th century. And then this is new. College Board Topic 1.8, Colonial Expansion, and this is huge, the Columbian Exchange. Explain the economic impact of European colonial expansion and the development of trade networks. The exchange of goods shifted the center of economic power in Europe from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic states and brought the latter into an expanding world economy. So your Mediterranean states, that's like Venice and Genoa. And there was a shift. The Atlantic states are like Portugal, Spain, France, England, the Dutch Republic. And Europe's colonial expansion led to a global exchange of goods, flora, and fauna, a shift toward European dominance, and the expansion of the slave trade. The exchange of new plants, animals, and diseases, the Columbian Exchange, created economic opportunities for Europeans. And then it goes on to say, explain the social and cultural impact of European colonial expansion and development of trade networks. Europe's colonial expansion led to a global exchange of goods, flora, fauna, cultural practices, and diseases, resulting in the destruction of some indigenous civilizations, a shift toward European dominance, and the expansion of the slave trade. And the exchange of new plants, animals, and diseases, the Columbian Exchange, in some cases, facilitated European subjugation and destruction of indigenous peoples, particularly in the Americas. So the slave trade, we're getting into that too. Explain the causes for and the development of the slave trade. Now this is early in the slave trade. It really doesn't ramp up until quite a bit later. But it says Europeans expanded the slave trade in response to the establishment of a plantation economy in the Americas and demographic catastrophes among indigenous peoples, which basically means that your Native Americans were dying so fast that you had to bring somebody else in from somewhere else to replace them, and that was Africa. And then College Board Topic 110, the Commercial Revolution. This is also huge. Explain European commercial and agricultural developments and their economic effects from 1450 to 1648. Innovations in banking, like, for example, the joint stock company and insurance and finance, promoted the growth of urban financial centers and a money economy. Wow, look at this map. Empires and trade routes all over the place. I see Portugal, I see Spain, I see the Dutch, the British. The Dutch and the British are just starting to come on the scene. And so, here is a review of the things that we have learned in this chapter so far. We've talked about the state of trade before Columbus. We talked about the Venetians and the Genoese, from Venice and Genoa. We talked about the gold and the spice and the luxury goods and the slave trades. And we've talked about the explorers, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and their motivations, their economic motivations, their religious motivations. We've talked about specific explorers like Henry the Navigator and Bartolomeo Diaz and Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan. And there were also competitors with Spain and Portugal, the English along the east coast of North America, the French in Canada and Louisiana, the Dutch in New Amsterdam. And we talked about those conquerors, what Hernán Cortés did to the Aztecs and what Francisco Pizarro did to the Incas, and what the Portuguese did in Brazil, bringing that plantation system that they had on the Atlantic island of Madeira and causing it to spread over not only Brazil, but also throughout the Caribbean. And we talked about where the Spanish and the French and the English and the Dutch used that same plantation model, and its principal engine was slavery. And we started to talk about how these colonies were administered. The Spanish and the Portuguese governments stepped in quickly and made these colonies official territories, and the Spanish called their colonies viceroyalties, and the Portuguese organized their colonies as captaincies, whereas the English colonies were much more localized, much less government control, much more autonomous. And we talked about how the Catholic Church was working hard to build churches and set up parishes and bishoprics and convert indigenous people. So the indigenous population loss and the economic exploitation, what a story. How did they do it? The Spanish crown instituted a system called the Encomienda system. And under the Encomienda system, conquerors were given grants called encomiendas, which legally allowed them to enslave native peoples as long as they did three things: provided food, provided shelter, and provided Christian teaching. But this encomienda system led to serious abuses like overwork, beatings, and sexual abuse. Luckily, there were missionaries who stood up to these abusive plantation owners, and we're actually going to see an example of that in the next lesson in 14.5. So this outcry from these missionaries led to the new laws in 1542, and we will go into more detail on how these new laws came about in the next presentation. But suffice it to say that Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, he was also king of Spain, instituted limits on this encomienda system, severe limits actually. And the biggest limit of all was a limit on the right to transfer ownership of exploited people to an heir in the event that encomiendero died. So there are some specifics regarding the new laws of 1542. For example, governors in these viceroyalties had to ensure the well-being and the preservation of the Native Americans, referred to as Indians by the law. Native Americans were not to be enslaved in the future for any reason, including war and rebellion. Currently enslaved Native Americans had to be freed immediately unless the owner could prove by going to Spain and going to court that the enslaved state was legal. The, quote, bad habit of making Native Americans work against their will or without fair payment must be ended immediately. And Native Americans could not be taken to remote areas to fish for pearls. And only the viceroy, the governor, had the right to establish encomiendas on Native Americans. Native Americans could not be redistributed to another encomendero if their previous encomendero died. Instead, the native people would then become subjects of the crown. And natives were required only to pay tribute to the encomenderos if they worked. Instead, they had to be paid wages for their work. So they couldn't be required to work. They could choose to work, but they couldn't be required to work. And Native Americans could not be forced to work in the mines, where many had died, unless it was absolutely necessary to work in those mines, like if there was an emergency or something like that. So, and if it was absolutely necessary to make them work in the mines, then they were to get the exact same working conditions as Spanish mine workers. Native Americans were to be taxed fairly and treated well, and public officials or clergy with Encomienda grants had to return those grants to the crown immediately, and Encomienda grants would not be passed on via inheritance, but would be canceled at the death of the individual grant holder, the encomendero. The whole Encomienda system had caused a disastrous decline of indigenous population due to overwork and exhaustion and abuse. And the new laws instituted a system of tribute payments from indigenous laborers. And this was one way that the Spanish could get the workforce that they needed without the systemic abuse of the Encomienda system. So a system of forced labor was called repartimiento in New Spain, and it was called the Mita system in Peru. It was government run, not run by those encomienderos. And if they couldn't work, then the natives could pay a tribute. Or they could work instead. And if they worked instead, it would be for a certain period of time each year, and it was often in public works projects like roads and bridges and things like that. And they would get a modest payment, and they could use their wages to pay their tribute. The disastrous decline of the indigenous population was due to numerous things. Here's a list: violence, disruption of agriculture, nothing to eat, disease, that was huge, overwork, exhaustion, malnutrition, decreased fertility, they weren't having children, high infant mortality. And then here's a list of the diseases that came to the New World from the Old World. Things like smallpox, measles, typhus, cholera, diphtheria, scarlet fever. And just about the only disease that came from the New World to the Old World was syphilis. And this disastrous decline of the indigenous population also happened everywhere that Europeans went. And sometimes the death rate was as high as 90%. And colonial administrators needed a new source of labor, and that source of labor was the Atlantic slave trade. So let's talk about life in the colonies. Spanish and Portuguese colonies relied heavily on native women and slave women, because European women, they just weren't coming to these colonies, and European women just weren't around to marry. And so interracial marriages would become more and more common as settlement progressed. Look at the picture right here. English attitudes, on the other hand, distinguished severely between the civilized people and the, quote, savage people. And this kind of prejudice among the English kept many Englishmen away from native women. In New France, what we would call Canada now, French settlement was low in general. The French just could not get people to go there and live. And so assimilation was encouraged as a way of solving this problem. 4/5, that's 4 out of 5, of female immigrants to the Americas before 1800 were African slaves. Abuse was very easy for their masters. But the mixing of indigenous peoples with Europeans and Africans was prevalent, and it created whole new types of population, whole new types of ethnic groups, like the mestizos. The mestizos were people of mixed Native American and European descent. And the mulattoes, people of color, these were people of mixed African and European descent. There was also a shift in world trade. The exchange of goods shifted the center of economic power in Europe from the Mediterranean, where it was dominated by the Genoese and the Venetians, to the Atlantic states, Spain, Portugal, England, France, Dutch Republic. And it brought the latter into an expanding world economy. The Venetians and the Genoese, they pretty much just gave in to these changes. So what was this Columbian Exchange? Well, here's what it was. It was a two-way exchange of animals, plants, diseases, people, cultures, ideas. And this exchange was between the New World and the Old World. When you're talking about the Old World was Europe, Africa, and Asia. The New World was North America and South America. And this exchange, it was not deliberately planned. It just happened through human activity. But it utterly transformed the Western Hemisphere. And it radically altered, and it's still going on today, radically altered the trajectory of all life on this planet. Earth has seen a major die-off of thousands of species in the last 500 years, and it is continuing. So what were some of the plants and foods that were exchanged between the New World and the Old World during the Columbian Exchange? Well, you can see this on this map. To the left you've got the Americas, and to the right you've got the Old World. So left is New World, right is Old World. And some of the things that came from the New World to the Old World were things like potatoes. You thought that the Irish had always had potatoes for thousands of years. No, they didn't have a single potato in Ireland until the New World was discovered. Potatoes, corn, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, squash, tomatoes, right? The Old World, they'd never seen tomatoes before, right? Chili peppers. They had pepper, but chili peppers didn't have chili peppers. And of course, tobacco. Foods that came from the Old World to the New World, foods that the New World had never seen, were all kinds of other grains, like wheat and rice and barley and oats and rye. I mean, the only grain that came from the New World to the Old World was corn. Bananas, coffee, fruits like apples, carrots, lettuce, onions. Well, what were some domesticated animals that were exchanged between the New World and the Old World during the Columbian Exchange? Well, the New World had just no draft animals at all. And the Old World had all these domesticated animals from way back, like pigs and cows and horses and sheep, chickens, rats. All of these animals came from the Old World. They had never been seen before in the New World. The only thing that we really that the Old World really got from the New World was turkeys. What were some diseases that were exchanged? And I already gave you a list, but here are some of these diseases between the New World and the Old World. The New World was the big loser on these diseases. Bubonic plague, smallpox, typhus, malaria, yellow fever, diphtheria, measles, influenza, whooping cough. And all these indigenous people got hit with a lot of these diseases all at the same time. They just couldn't handle it. There were people exchanged between the New World and the Old World during the Columbian Exchange. For example, slaves. You see that on the top right. And then on the bottom right picture, settlers, millions of settlers. Ideas. Hey, what was one strong idea that was exchanged between the New World and the Old World during the Columbian Exchange? There you go. Christianity. Columbian Exchange highlights. Number one, wheat, coffee, fruits. These came to the New World. And maize, which is corn, right? Potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, all went from the New World to the Old World. Northern Europe did not have potatoes until the New World was discovered. Italy didn't have tomato sauce. Can you imagine that? They didn't have tomato sauce until the New World was discovered. And India, they didn't have the kind of peppers you use for curry. They didn't have curry until the New World was discovered. Corn, maize, became a staple in Spain, Portugal, southern France, Italy, southeastern Europe, southern China, and I think you know where this is going. And potatoes. Potatoes spread across Europe, especially northern Europe, and led directly to a massive rise in the European population level. Epidemic diseases that swept the Western Hemisphere after 1492. It was really kind of an extension of the Black Plague. Native peoples were completely unprepared for the microbes that Europeans brought with them. Europeans brought these microbes, these organisms with them on their livestock, their cattle, their pigs, their chickens, and Europeans brought these organisms with them on their own bodies. Europeans did not know that they were doing this. Of course, it wasn't on purpose. But nevertheless, millions of Native Americans died from these diseases. The close connection between sugar and slavery. For Mediterranean Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, as we have seen, was already a source for slaves before 1492. Slaves were a status symbol. We've seen that. And Portuguese merchants had been seeking slaves along the western coast of Africa for quite some time at this point. And they had brought hundreds of enslaved Africans to Lisbon each year from 1444, when we saw that first auction, to all the way to 1530. And by 1550, Lisbon's population was 10% African. And the Portuguese were already using slaves on sugar plantations on their island of Madeira in the Atlantic Ocean near Portugal. Slavery, unfortunately, made economic sense with regard to sugar production, because you got to know some things about sugar. The European demand for sugar was growing, and sugar was a very, very labor-intensive crop, and it was very expensive to grow for profit. And sugar grows year-round, and you need to process sugar cane immediately as soon as it is cut and harvested, because it goes bad within 24 hours, and so the pressure is on. And so the transatlantic slave trade to Brazil, where the Portuguese were growing a lot of sugar, began quite naturally around 1518. And on this particular map, you can see the island of Madeira down in about the bottom center right there, and you can see Portugal and Spain, and then another Portuguese territory, the Azores, is way out there on the left. The Dutch West, don't get them confused, the Dutch West India Company was founded in 1621 by the Dutch, and it was a western version of the massive Dutch East India Company. And the company forcefully took much of Brazil from the Portuguese in 1630, and the Dutch West India Company brought in their own governor in 1637, and the Dutch West India Company ran the colony until the Portuguese got this colony back in 1654. And at first, the Dutch were going to be all noble and high and mighty and keep these colonies free of slavery. Then they found out, when they tried to make it work, that it was pretty much impossible to operate a profitable plantation system without slave labor. So the Dutch started bringing slaves to their plantations in Brazil as well. The English got into the Atlantic slave trade in a big way. In 1660, the English crown formed the Royal African Company, RAC for short. And its leader was none other than, no kidding, King James II, the Duke of York at the time. He hadn't become king yet. And from 1662 to 1689, the RAC had a monopoly on the Atlantic slave trade. And between 1662 and 1732, the Royal African Company, the RAC, transported about 212,000 Africans. Now, of those 212,000 Africans, 44,000 died on the way. That's more than 20% dead. Interestingly, not of defense in any way, crew members on those slave ships died at about the same rate. Death rates were also high on the plantations, and all of this death made a steady flow of new shipments of slaves necessary to replace the ones that were dying. It's estimated that 10 million enslaved Africans were forced to migrate to the Western Hemisphere. And they labored at many different things. Some were miners, some were even soldiers and sailors and servants and artisans. But the vast majority, of course, were crop laborers. Spanish silver and its economic effects on the entire world. Silver was discovered at a place called Potosi in 1545, and this was a a mine, and it was located in modern-day Bolivia. And huge amounts of precious metals were transported to Spain between 1503 and 1650. And that included 3.5 million pounds of silver that was made into coins. And it included 600,000 pounds of gold. And this made Spain very, very rich for a very relatively short time. Then it caused widespread inflation in Spain. And we know that's not a good thing. And then this Spanish inflation spread to the rest of Europe. And when the amount of money rises, as you may know, that money becomes worth less. When the money is worth less, the things we buy start to cost us more. The Chinese only accepted silver as payment for trade. They needed more silver badly. And so China absorbed half the world's production of silver. And one reason for this is that the Chinese were actually getting away from using paper currency, and they were returning to silver coins. And you can imagine how much silver would be needed to supply the gigantic Chinese economy with silver coins. They needed a lot of silver to do this. So the birth of the global economy. 3 successive commercial empires emerged in the birth of this global economy. First, the Portuguese. The Portuguese, they found that sea route to India, Vasco da Gama. They traded largely in sugar. And then the Spanish. The Spanish founded a land empire in the New World. Portuguese weren't that interested in a land empire. And the Spanish also traded American silver for Chinese silk out of their base in Manila in the Philippines. And then you had the Dutch. The Dutch formed the Dutch East India Company. So you got two Dutch companies. You got your Dutch West India Company, and then you've got your Dutch East India Company, which was much, much larger and much more successful and had much, much more longevity. And the Dutch traded mostly in spices. And they also fought to take trade from the Portuguese and from the Spanish. So the Dutch Republic. The Dutch began sending commercial spice expeditions to the Indian Ocean soon after the Dutch Republic was formed in 1581. And in 1602, the Dutch formed this Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company lasted almost 200 years, from 1602 to 1800. It was also one of the first publicly traded companies, meaning that the general public, the investor, could buy stock, could buy ownership in this company in the form of stock as a financial investment. And the Dutch East India Company became the most valuable company of all time, including, we're talking Disney, we're talking Walmart, we're talking Apple, Google. That company, if it was around today, would be worth $7.9 trillion in today's money. They had about 20,000 ships. And on the surface, the Dutch East India Company was a shipping and trading company. But, think about this. What's Amazon? Does Amazon, one of the biggest and most profitable countries in the world, right? Do they make anything? No. All they do is do transactions and shipping. And they're making an absolute fortune, right? So that's, there's your Dutch East India Company, today's modern version of the Dutch East India Company. Now, in reality, the Dutch East India Company had many more powers and functions than any normal company. It could literally wage a war against other countries. Can you imagine, like, Amazon decided to go to war, like with, Costa Rica or something? It could imprison and execute convicts, right? It could negotiate treaties with other countries. I mean, can you imagine, like, Amazon negotiating a treaty with Russia or China? It could establish colonies around the world. It could mint its own coins. That reminds me of like Mr. Robot with E Corp or something. And it was an early transnational and global corporation. And the Dutch East India Company was the Dutch Republic's main instrument of warfare. The English and the French. The English also had an East India Company, and they used that company to establish colonies in India. And its purpose was to compete with the Dutch and the Portuguese for trade in India. And the French also managed to establish a trading colony in India. But the peak of English and French colonial power was still to come. Their rise to prominence would happen in the 18th century.